Let me welcome Dr. Douglas Cumming to our session today. Dr. Cumming is the DeSantis Distinguished Professor of Finance and Entrepreneurship at Florida Atlantic University. He has a PhD from University of Toronto, as well as a JD, which is a law degree in North America, and a CFA. So you can already tell that he's a high achiever. He's the managing editor-in-chief of the Review of Corporate Finance and British Journal of Management, which is again a combination that you don't see very often, finance and management, editor-in-chief of two journals in two different areas. As an aside, my wife, who's a finance professor, I was telling her that Dr. Cumming is our guest speaker today, and she said what she would like to ask him is, how does he manage his time? He does so much. Not only is he the editor-in-chief of two major journals, he's also published 21 academic books, including Crowdfunding, Fundamental Cases, Facts, and Insights. So if you're interested in crowdfunding research and teaching, you might want to read that. And he's published over 195 articles. That is not a typo, my friends. It is actually 195 articles, including in leading journals like AMJ, JFE, that's Journal of Financial Economics, Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis, RFS, so that's the top tier of finance journals, JIBS, among others, with about 20,000 Google Scholar citations. So with that, Dr. Cumming, welcome to our session.
Thanks very much. It's great to join you. I don't believe I have access to screen sharing. Oh, now I do. Super. So thanks. It's really a privilege to join you, and I really appreciate it. And it's great to learn about your conference, and I hope to participate again in future years as a listener to see whatever everybody else is doing. I have been in Florida now for 4 years, and originally when we discussed doing the session, I thought I was going to present an academic paper, and it turns out that's not what you want to hear from me. And I get to talk more informally about, things that I've done to get me where I am today, which depending on who you ask is either a good or bad position today. So I hopefully will, give you some insights as to my experiences so that you can better guide your own work. So I think that's the goal for today. And so I did make some slides, which I hope are helpful. And, for sessions like this, sometimes I talk a little bit too openly. So I'll probably say more than I should. So just as a warning, but I like to talk frankly about these topics. So the topics that Michelle had suggested were the area of entrepreneurial finance and where I fit into things. Past and future of entrepreneurial finance research, some opportunities and challenges for new people in the area. And lastly, crowdfunding is a possible fertile area of research that intersects between entrepreneurship and finance. So those are the three things that I will cover. And I appreciate, again, the suggestion to cover these topics, because they're definitely ones that I can say a bit about. So in the entrepreneurial finance field, entrepreneurship, I think, is a very fun area. It's definitely interdisciplinary. So some universities have entrepreneurship departments, and other universities that I've been at have sort of informal departments where you have maybe someone from management is interested, maybe someone from finance or economics, law, and then even in the engineering folks, they like to get into entrepreneurship, write the odd paper. And certainly a huge part of it is the psychology. So lots of papers intersecting psychology and entrepreneurship. And so it's so diverse that it's almost a hard to define area. And we have many theories, data sets, methods, and then intersecting, of course, with policy. So the law folks, of course, write about this, but but all of the other folks as well, much of their work has important policy implications. And so what I would describe the area of research is it's, I think, important, but that's my self-bias. You know, I would say it's the most important area, but we all have high opinions of ourselves. And then the other way I'd describe it is highly segmented, very, very segmented, which is both good and bad. Maybe a little more bad than good. I think that we have a lot to do to desegment work in entrepreneurship. That's, you know, if I were to suggest any useful thing I would say today is that segmentation has caused some harm in the area, and, you know, less segmentation would enrich people's work, come up with more interesting papers, open up dialogue across scholars more, and those segmentations happen even within, you know, narrow segments of people strictly focused on entrepreneurial finance, for example. And so I'll talk about that today as well. So, you know, super briefly about me, as I had already said too many generous things, but I threw up this slide just because, you know, the things that I say are going to reflect my background. And perhaps the most important thing that I would just tell you is that I do interdisciplinary work in a variety of fields. I have been working at various places around the world, including Canada. I'm from Canadian originally. I apologize about that. I was born there. I couldn't help it. And I find myself living in Florida, which is a bit of a culture shock for me. I've been here since 2018. So, so how did I get started into entrepreneurial finance? Well, it, you know, basically happened in a law school class. So back in the 1990s, I was a JD PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I was in a law school class called Financing the Small Firm, taught by Jeff McIntosh. He's a law professor at the University of Toronto. And, you know, he told me that this topic's interesting, and he knew that I was doing some empirical work because he gave me a job one summer as a PhD student. You know, you're hanging out at the university looking for work, and he needed someone to do RA work for him. So he hired me to do some RA work for him. That's how I met him. And then he told me that, you know, in the 90s, he said venture capital's taking off, and I have some venture capital data, so why don't we write some venture capital papers? That's how it got started, without a joke. And I realized that, oh yeah, this is really a great area. And so being in Canada, what happened was there was a Canadian Venture Capital Association, and this Canadian association collected data that other associations didn't collect around the world. Like, so even in the US, there was no data on this topic that had like wide industry data. And so the topic was on what securities do venture capitalists use? And so it's a pretty basic question, you know, you think, how could that be original? But back in the 90s, that was an original topic. And so what I discovered in Canada, you know, I just looked at the data as this student doing a project for a class. I looked at the data from the Canadian Venture Capital Association, and it said venture capitalists, you know, they mostly use common equity, and then sometimes use convertible securities, sometimes convertible preferred equity, sometimes convertible debt, you know, mixes of different securities. And they had this huge data set, like in the venture capital sphere at this time, you know, the papers that have been published only had very small number of observations, like between 50 to 200 observations. And that'd be like a top tier paper back then. And so here's this Canadian data set with thousands of observations. Like the data that I eventually published had over 10,000 transactions. And what the data say is that the data said that, you know, convertible preferred equity are not the most frequently used security. And so I came up with some tests as to why different securities are used depending on the context. And at the time, you know, in venture capital, there were only 3 possible reviewers that were for any sort of finance paper in the topic. And And those three reviewers, like, you know, because hardly anyone was working on the topic, and they all had papers that said convertible preferred equity is optimal. And man, did they not like my paper, you know? So they just, you know, I made them very angry apparently, you know, and so I had referee reports that said, you know, you're like, I'm paraphrasing, but if you allow me to paraphrase, you're stupid, Canadians are stupid and unsophisticated. Who cares about Canada? You know, why don't you go back into your little hovel of a corner, you know? And I was just like, holy smokes, this is a really crazy business. And it was so crazy that I almost thought I should just give up academics. I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. Like, you know, obviously my data are better than their data, and this is really absurd. And so then I was on a flight to go to Frankfurt. So I was flying from Toronto to Frankfurt in 2002. And I happened to get an email about this paper from these guys. It wasn't yet published yet. It was this paper that came out in the Harvard Law Review. And they did me the courtesy of sending me the paper. Now, the thing is, the first time anybody ever cited anything of mine, even though I started in 1999. And so they cited my paper. They said, this might interest you, you know. So I opened it up on the flight, you know, and I was in a somewhat depressed mode all the time back then. And I remember getting that paper and I thought, okay, I'll read it on the flight. And it made me so happy. Like I was like dancing up and down the halls of the airplane because this paper basically said that there's a tax bias that favor certain securities, like in particular convertible preferred equity in the US, that doesn't exist in other countries. And, you know, so it was all of a sudden, wow, all of a sudden I had like an authoritative source by top lawyers. These were guys at Columbia and Stanford, these law school guys. And then all of a sudden, for other people, my paper became interesting. And so, you know, but what happened was, so I eventually published myself in 2005, even though I started working on it in, you know, 1996, 1997. Then I had a draft in 1998, you know, and then it gets published in 2005, you know, sort of ridiculous after having millions of rejection letters. And I published sort of two versions because I was in a finance department. So I wrote one paper that got published in the Journal of Corporate Finance, and then another one that got published, a different version, more entrepreneurship oriented, for Journal of Business Venturing. And, you know, after so many years on topic, you know, like it was just really ridiculous. Like, it's so what I realized is that academics is not fair. Like, there's nothing fair about it, right? And then the second thing I realized is that you got to be diversified. Like, so if you only have a couple of papers and you're basing your whole career on a couple of papers, then you possibly could, you know, win the lottery and you write something that your reviewers like. But, you know, if you don't happen to be lucky, then you could just be, your career could be subjected to some potentially biased people that, you know, don't want to approve your paper because it makes their paper less impactful. So from that, I thought, well, if I'm going to survive in academics, I got to write a lot of papers and I have to work on many topic areas. Like, so I didn't want to just be an entrepreneurial finance person anymore. So I had the good fortune of going to Australia for a year after, around 2004 to 5. And I got really interested in a topic that's popular there on fraud and misconduct, especially in securities trading. So I got into that topic, one of my favorite ones these days. But I also write papers in IB, law, like pure entrepreneurship papers that have nothing to do with finance, securities regulation, governance papers. So I just became sort of the jack of all trades to minimize risks. And then, yeah, just write a large number of papers. It's almost like thinking of a finance portfolio problem is the way I started to look at it. Because it was either that or just drop out of academics. And I thought, yeah, for a long time, I thought I just should. You know, I even met one of these three reviewers, by the way, at a conference in 2001. And he told me that I've ruined my career by trying to promote my stupid Canadian data, and other people giving me the advice that I should leave academics now. I'll never get tenure given what I was trying to promote with just by saying what data told us. And so it's really, I thought this is a really hostile business, to be really blunt about it. And so that's where things were at in my case. And so we have not that much time, so let me speed up a bit. So then, I said entrepreneurial finance research is segmented. And so one way it's segmented is, where did the data come from? And so the data in entrepreneurial finance is typically from the source of capital. So for example, if you go and buy venture capital data, you could buy it from, SDC, Preqin, PitchBook. There's probably a few more vendors. I'm not thinking clearly right now, but there's tons of places to buy data. It only has venture capital data. So you have no idea what the bank finance was, if it also has angel finance, factoring, accounts receivable, trade credit, other ways in which entrepreneurs raise money. You don't know that when you buy that from the venture capital data. So people pretend, well, they got venture capital. That's the only form of finance that they have. And they don't know or don't care about other forms of finance. Same thing when people are surveying angel investors, they typically don't know about their other form of finance. Or if you're getting crowdfunding data, you typically scrape the web and, well, you don't know if they've gotten other sources like bank finance or some other thing. And so it tends to be very segmented. And so people don't want to recognize that fact. And then the other way in which it's segmented is that, people in the journals, they don't want to cite each other. So they literally, like if you have a finance paper where the paper has already been done in a management journal or an entrepreneurship journal, the finance people, they just won't acknowledge that it's been done in the entrepreneurship area. And they just publish their paper as if they've discovered something new, when that's not the case at all. And by the way, vice versa happens as well. And so those kind of things are not that good. And then even within the finance area, an equally problematic issue is that there are those that have sort of, I guess to be, the rumor is that some people might have preferential access to some journals, but certainly the way in which the finance field works is that there's some unwritten rule that if you're publishing in a top 3 journal, you're only obligated to cite other papers in top 3 journals. So if you're published, say, in the Journal of Corporate Finance, someone can redo your topic and publish it in one of the top 3 journals, and they have no ethical obligation to cite it one of the lower tier journals, because the top 3 journals are so much better than the other journals. I'm saying this with a bit of tongue in cheek, but it's like a great way to get topic areas for people that have undue access, So that kind of thing tends to go on quite frequently. That's happened to me more often than I care to admit. So those kind of things are somewhat problematic. And I published a paper in Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal with Sophia Johan a couple of years ago that describes these problems and even provides empirical evidence on these problems. Also segmented by author groups. I'll show you some data in a minute. By country, people tend to have the US base versus other countries, and so actually I recently was very lucky to join this team doing a bibliometric review of venture capital. And so I'll show you a bit of data on this topic. So you have the frequency of papers published each year in venture capital versus private equity, including all journals, finance, entrepreneurship, management, law, etc. And so the frequency of papers and the number of citations to papers in venture capital is higher than that for private equity. Here's a graphical look at who cites whom. And, you see if you want to look at the finance folks, they just cite other finance journals. It's these purple lines. And then there's a set of journals that, the green in terms of the type of journal they are, that tend to cite each other. And then another type of, these are more entrepreneurship journals, another type of management journals tend to cite each other. etc. So there's not a lot of cross overlap in these citation patterns. And this is from, 100% of the data out there from the last 20 years, 2001 through 2020 or 21, I guess. And then even more so on the journals for the private equity, this was venture capital. Venture capital, there's a bit of intermixing, and private equity is absolutely unbelievable how segmented it is. If you're doing private equity, like especially in the finance area that's highlighted by the super thick links, these are the top 3 journals, Journal of Finance, RFS, and JFE. Those journals, they literally don't, almost never cite anything outside of those journals. And even though topic areas and everything very much would warrant the otherwise. And then, but again, same types of problems. You have the management and entrepreneurship journals tend to want to ignore the ones in finance. This is, in terms of author groups, so you do get cartels of authors that work together, and it shows it quite clearly. And then the size of the names are just, the frequency and links between authors, basically, is how this is showing up here. So the author cartels, and then in terms of citations amongst author groups, people are very keen on self-citations across author groups. And according to the data, I'm a little bit guilty about this as well. I'm being awfully critical of other people, but I am equally guilty on these things. More on these author groups and networks. Perhaps going a little bit too far with all these data. They're in our survey paper, if you're curious about that kind of thing. Okay, so that leads to our last topic. Hopefully have a little bit of time for the last topic, and then we can have questions. So is crowdfunding a fertile area of research? And I certainly think so. This is kind of, this thing's in the way, make this over here. So what we have on this slide is what we have on this slide is a picture of Google Scholar hits. So what I did is I went over to Google Scholar and I typed in different keywords that are indicated at the bottom, and then see how many documents came up per year. And so you could easily go and do this. It takes you about maybe an hour, I guess, to do this kind of thing. And then I created an index because, the numbers of citations varies a lot. And if you don't index it, then the graph doesn't look very nice. So I indexed it in the middle year, 2015, to show at 100, to show for each of these levels, to show how it's, where it came from and where it's going. And so the crowdfunding stuff is the area that's been rapidly growing the most. So these are papers on crowd lending or debt crowdfunding up at the top, equity crowdfunding, in general, all types of crowdfunding, rewards crowdfunding, which has tapered off a little bit. And then you compare it to other topic areas like, venture capital, private equity is really flat, trade credit, those types of, or banks, those aren't areas that are growing very much at all. And so when I look back over the years, then I would say the things that become relevant here are, if you want to think, well, which areas are getting cited a lot, I would say the crowdfunding area is getting way more frequently cited than some other areas. And certainly for me over the last, say, 5 to 7 years, the papers that I've written, I think that are getting the most cites are in the crowdfunding area. So that's perhaps one incentive to work on the area. There we go. So why is crowdfunding popular? Well, one thing for sure, it touches on all the different areas. So doesn't matter, you don't need to be in entrepreneurial finance to want to work in crowdfunding. There's papers published in MIS, marketing, psychology, econ, papers in region development and public policy, the regulation side, accounting, strategy, all these different disciplines. can use crowdfunding to inform their area. And there's different theoretical angles. It's not hard to get data. So you can buy data sets, but you don't really need to. If you use Python, you can scrape the web, or use surveys if you have other things that can't be scraped. So large amounts of data, very large sample sizes, especially compared to, say, venture capital. The crowdfunding data sets can easily get into the hundreds of thousands of observations if you're doing loan and rewards crowdfunding. Equity crowdfunding, there are fewer transactions, but there's still lots of data that you can look at. Another fun thing about this is that you don't just need to look at numbers. You can do text mining, because there's all sorts of text available that can be matched with crowdfunding. So and like as a fun example, we've seen in some projects that we've done that the quality of the writing of the pitch is highly correlated with not just success, but if you're a really bad writer, then that tends to be a good signal that you're probably fraudulent, like there's a fraudulent campaign. And so this is becoming increasingly important in practice. So what we did is, just in case this is kind of fun, if you want to look at US equity crowdfunding, let me see if I can open up this page. So we created this available online. You just go FAU crowdfunding tracker. And so if you want to look at the data, you could, so here's the activity on crowdfunding in the US. Pick the state that's of interest to you. Then all sorts of things on firm characteristics that you could examine. Say assets, and you could, I defaulted to Florida, of course, but you could pick any particular state. If we don't want to compare to everything, let's compare to, I don't know, New York or something. So you see how things have evolved over time in terms of assets of companies that are raising money, and amongst other things, of course, like firm revenues, how old these firms are, other things. So it's easily available, and we got all these data from the SEC. We just put it up there just because it helps our students and entrepreneurs if they want to get involved in crowdfunding. So those are things that are available. So, let me, I want to go back to my PowerPoint slides. This is on security design. That's what I initially started talking about today. So you look at all the different forms of securities that are used in crowdfunding. Right, my computer started misbehaving. I don't know why I can't see. Oh, there's my slides. So we've done a few papers on this crowdfunding stuff, and I put up some graphs here that show a bit of insight as to what's going on, but there's tons of other scope for new papers that can be written on the crowdfunding. This is the equity crowdfunding side, and maybe this is a bit too much detail of where things are happening, but maybe if I can tell you just one quick fun story that I found to be quite interesting, if you want a COVID implication here, is that crowdfunding, and amongst other things, has taken off in Florida. So here's my Florida bias. So that, pre-COVID crowdfunding and other things weren't so prevalent in Florida. And then compared to New York, but then once COVID hit, it seemed that between, for a variety of reasons, tons of people have migrated to Florida, and they've left places like California and New York for to be the biggest two regions. That's caused, a huge influx of people, much higher property prices, and much more economic activity, including but not limited to crowdfunding. And so even for at least one of these quarters post-COVID, we see even more crowdfunding in Florida than New York. So kind of fun to look at these shifts, and this particular one, we just published this paper in Journal of Small Business Management to talk about these particular issues going on post-COVID. So that's everything I wanted to say. Hopefully I finished in time, leave a bit of time for questions, and hopefully I didn't say too much, be a little bit too frank, but I guess maybe to conclude, I guess if I were to offer a bit of advice, you just have to have a pretty thick skin and, work hard, write a lot of papers, and hopefully survive this academic game. Thank you.
So Dr. Cumming, let me start with the first question, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for questions. You said you start about 10 papers every year. Now, what would be your advice be to junior scholars? Our audience here is people who are new to entrepreneurship research, some of them PhD students, some of them junior faculty. In terms of starting papers every year, what would be your advice to them?
Well, like maybe from an editor's perspective, the first thing that I would do if you think you have a new idea is go to Google Scholar and check to see what's been written on the topic. So when I meet with PhD students here and we talk about new ideas, we're really not sure if it's new until we check. And so we do go to Google Scholar and, examine what else has been written on this topic. Can we compete in this area? Because it is a very competitive business. And then the other sort of big advice is once you do believe you have a novel topic, then the thing that you might consider doing, if possible, and if it's relevant for your topic, if you're doing empirical work, is to merge data sets. And so that's one thing I've encouraged people very often is if you can think of ways to merge existing data sets, then that gives you a big lead time on being, having a monopoly over the topic area where someone isn't going to, beat you to a journal or that kind of thing, or at least it gives you at least a temporary monopoly. And to give an example of this, going back to the fraud literature, we had an idea with a PhD student and I a couple of years ago that we thought, well, we wonder if, fraud and manipulation is more common during natural disasters. And so we thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And we're inspired to think about this because of the COVID stuff. And so we looked at natural disasters more generally that include floods, hurricanes, ice storms, those sort of things. And so we had to merge, data from the Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration Center with our fraud data set that we had, and nobody merged those things before. And so a very lengthy merging process. And I think that was helpful for us to get a new topic area. So whatever your case is, double check Google Scholar, think of ways that you can protect your area by merging data sets or generating your own new data. And then that's probably going to help get you to the finish line.
And how many papers do you think a junior scholar or a PhD student or a junior faculty member should be working on at any given time, considering all the issues with reviewer bias and other things that you brought up earlier?
Yeah, I guess well, of course, like when you finish your PhD, the normal rule of thumb is that you want to have 2 or 3 papers that, depending on your requirements at your university, that's going to get you your degree if they're publishable quality. But I guess how would I put this? When I was a student, I had in the back of my head is, well, I want to make tenure, so I don't have to just think about 2 or 3 for my thesis. I could do a few more, and then similarly over the years, I've tried to work on, I guess, a variety of papers at a time. So what's optimal is going to depend on the particular person. In my case, going back many years ago, my PhD advisor told me that in academics, your only friend is your papers, so which is sort of a sad thing to say, like but your papers are sort of what stay with you and help you build your career. So the more you work on it, the more you're like being your own entrepreneur to keep building it up. And then there can be trade-offs between quantity and quality that are important. So you always want to aim for the most impactful work, but with the caveat at the same time is that if you're spending 100% of your time on one paper, then that, there's risks involved with doing that. And so by working on more projects and getting things more developed over time, then that can be useful for your career. The other thing too is that, with co-authorship, it could sometimes work really great, and other times it could be a tremendous drag on your time, depending on who your co-authors are. And I've had one or two co-author experiences that I've regretted, but mostly I've been extremely lucky with my co-authors. And so that can really help your productivity. So you want to develop a good network of people that you like to work with.
So at this time, I'll invite Jadwiga. She has a deep philosophical question based on your presentation. So Jadwiga, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hello, Professor Douglas. It's great to see you. Thank you for all the insights. I'm just, as Professor Gupta said, being a little bit philosophical and getting into this profession with all these up and downs, as you even mentioned, considering quitting at some point. That's great to hear from so experienced a professor, but there are so many challenges. So I'm just wondering, if we think about academia and our profession as one of many aims to accumulate all this knowledge and disseminate it, and then we see that this different fields progress as data sadly maybe mostly show that it's not so. Some people already discovered an idea and they kind of keep rediscovering it in different fields instead of just building or standing on the shoulders of the giants, so to speak. Why do you think that's the case? And maybe perhaps how can we correct these patterns? Or is it just the reality of a profession, and if somebody wants to build a career, that's how it should develop? Just being very frank.
Yeah, that's, all the great questions and tricky questions. In terms of why it happens, I would just say there are financial rewards, so if you're an early scholar that gets into the top journal in your field, so say if you're in management, that might be something like AMJ or one of those type of journals, or in finance, the top 3 journals I mentioned before, et cetera, for the different fields, then the dollar value of that publication can be very large. Like I've seen estimates that the career value to that can well be over $1 million. And so you're thinking, you think, wow, is that really true? But indeed, it's true. So that's looking at the present discounted value of your future career earnings. And so there have even been formal estimates of these kind of things. And so if you have that as the enticement, that this is going to get me the better job and tenure and the better place and a salary bump up, and over the years it's worth that much to me, then of course people are going to do crazy things in order to get that financial benefit. And of course there's some non-pecuniary prestige associated with this that academics are very likely to care about, because that's probably why they went into academics in the first place and not a higher paying private sector job. And so so then how do you prevent these kind of things? Well, I think with a bit of technology, it's becoming easier. I mentioned Google Scholar before, and that when new people start searching, it's not like, you go to Google Scholar and you tell it, only finance journals that are in the top 3, come up, please. You can't search like that, right? So you type in a topic and then everybody else can see that, oh, you just ripped someone off from another field. And then so that's helpful. It's not going to cure things perfectly, and editors are time constrained, and they're not going to care. An editor of one journal in one field doesn't see a proper reference to other people in other fields. They don't have the time, or they don't want to care. They're just hoping the paper will get cited a lot because it makes their journal look better. So that's hopefully that'll evolve over time. But more interdisciplinary scholarship, I think, is better for all of us, and people need to get out of their silos more. That's for sure.
That's very good advice, that people need to get out of their silos more. We say that to the PhD students here too. So thank you for echoing that. Junho, you want to ask the next question?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, it's really great to talk to you, Dr. Cumming. Yeah, it's something that people who are in the renowned book comes up in my eye. So I have okay. So I have one research specific question to you. So I'm interested in the outcomes of the accelerators, and I'm still exploring what can be my dissertation topics, especially focusing on accelerators. And I just want to talk about what can be metrics that can examine the outcomes of the accelerators. So so far, I just narrowly focused on venture capital funding because I have fortunately get an access to PitchBook and Preqin or some of those platforms. But I just want to ask, what can be the other sources that examine the financial performances or about the debt information, debt or loans that startups get from the banks or something like that? Is there any platforms that I can access to those information or else? So those are my questions.
Great. Yeah, those are great questions, and definitely tough questions, because we could be talking about that for quite a while. So I might make a few brief suggestions now, and then we could definitely follow up if we start exchanging emails. I've seen some recent papers on topic that I could send over to you, and partly these things become data available dependent. So different places have different ways of measuring. And then, as an example, I've seen a paper recently out of Calgary that I think is very good, that has neat measures for this. It might, of course, reflect my Canadian bias that I find it interesting. But yeah, that's tricky stuff. And then the other thing that I would just say briefly is that, and this applies not just to accelerators, but all types of entrepreneurship research, is that we have treatment effects and selection effects. So selection comes before treatment, and there's some really good papers on this, like in the venture capital area. I think of a few really good ones in Research Policy by Massimo Colombo and others. And so the issue is that who gets picked to come into the accelerator, and then what are the outcomes associated with that? And so disentangling the treatment issue from the selection issue, could be a very useful way to understand how the accelerators work. But that's not limited to work in accelerators. But I think papers that do that disentangling can be very informative for everybody. But please fire me an email, and happy to have a longer chat about that offline, or by phone, of course. By email or phone, happy to chat.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
You too. Thanks.
Oscar, you want to go next?
Yes, Professor. Professor Cumming, thank you so much for this presentation. Very interesting. I'm interested now in cognitive behaviors. This is part of what I'm interested in researching. So I'm wondering, in the finance research, do you see some potential for research in terms of understanding the biases, but not just in gender terms, more like in behavioral biases, like non-verbal behaviors? Do you see some interest on that in the finance research journals for this type of research?
Yeah. Well, certainly behavioral finance has become a great topic in finance, of course. it was, I think, the 2017 Nobel Prize topic. So Richard Thaler from the University of Chicago. If you watch the movie The Big Short, you would have even seen him in the movie. I think he had like a famous singer explain what he does because he's not exciting enough. They needed to, you have to see the movie. It's pretty funny. So those topics indeed are quite fun. And the finance area in general, I think, is running out of topics, so going back in the good old days, people were like, oh, why do we, care about something other than rational decision makers? And then all the papers got written on that. And so they had to start broadening to get new topic areas. And so indeed, behavioral is one of the big ones. It's just the one thing people don't like about it is that, you can come up with any sort of theory to explain anything, right? So it's behavioral is sort of becomes, well, we don't understand it, so we'll come up with a new behavioral explanation to account for it. So some people that are traditionalists don't like it, but it certainly, I think, is helpful and useful. The gender angle that you mentioned briefly has some elements to this, and I think people are becoming increasingly aware that that's an important area. And so the diversity in finance work, which has in part a behavioral component, not entirely, but in part has become an increasingly important area. And, I'd say one of the more important areas because a lot of policy issues and regulatory changes with that, including the NASDAQ diversity rule that was put in place last year. So those are things that I think that'll become increasingly worth studying. So I certainly like the topic.
Yeah, my question is also oriented because now with these crowdfunding platforms, I think that finance is a little bit more democratic. So we might probably suffer a little bit more of domestic mindset biases, like people will be supporting causes, following what they see in their country. And there is, I don't know, this is something that I'm wondering.
Yeah, no, I'd say for sure that the crowdfunding context offers great ways to think about and look at decision making at the individual level. And some papers I've seen on this, for example, go to the extent to, even what cues people pay attention to, like, for example, are they going to look at detailed financial information or just very easy to understand signals? And it appears that the latter, where they just, pay attention to the easy to understand signals over having to look at complicated financial information is what tends to happen. But yeah, the huge scope for that. And the behavioral stuff can be quite fun and interesting and help us also understand country differences, as you mentioned. So I think it's great.
Christina,
thank you, Professor.
You want to go next?
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your time. I'm one of the many people that are working in the area of equity crowdfunding and crowdfunding in general and gender. So based on our reading from the 2019 special issue introduction, where you were discussing about what are the new areas that could be examined in the future in entrepreneurial finance. That was back in 2019. Now we have, it's post-COVID time, we have things like NFTs and new things are coming up. So I was just wondering, what is your, what are your insights on where the field is going? And, if you have any idea on what kind of future research is going to be happening in the next couple of years?
Really great question. So I wasn't able to attend a conference earlier this week in Milan, but my spouse was able to go. And if you don't know, back in 2004, right in this month in 2004, I met my spouse and then my future spouse. And 1 year later to the day, I married her because I figured, we started out as co-authors. And I was like, okay, I have to know where she is at all times, So I thought I better marry her, So that was how that happened. And so her name's Sophia Johan. And so Sophia was able to go to Milan and I was not. But the reason I mention it is that just this morning, we have a dog, we had to go walk our dog. So we were talking about, as we often do, we were talking about work. And so what came up was that she told me that one of the great keynotes at this conference in Milan was from Sophie Manigaard, and she's a very successful venture capital, entrepreneurial finance research in Belgium, a very nice lady as well. And she was talking precisely about that, about what do we need in the future in terms of new research opportunities, and what about NFTs? Does that offer scope for new topic areas? And that was precisely the topic of her keynote. And I understand she's writing a survey paper based on her slides that she gave. So you might ask her about that. I wish I saw the presentation. I just heard it was very good. So I'm like the middleman relaying the information. But I would say that, if you're trying to come up with new areas, that's absolutely fun one, and other things more generally in the fintech area, so and you might think, well, fintech, isn't that just for the finance people? And you shouldn't think that way at all. Absolutely not. There's so many great things that can be used for entrepreneurship research that of course might intersect with finance, but that's brilliant to have those angles in psychology and other ways to enrich that discussion. And then of course, who comes up with these ideas are the entrepreneurs. And so that's how we need to think about it. And it brings in other angles too, including marketing and other topics. So the more you intersect these things, I think the better it will be. So indeed, this is going to be a great booming new area.
Thank you.
You bet.
Sumit, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor. So my question is that, last few days we were discussing about this entrepreneurial failure. And so one question came to my mind that we talk a lot about, new venture failure. But I have seen cases wherein, accelerators or these institutes or these, sort of organizations which support ventures, they sort of also fail, right? But there is not enough, discussion on what happens to them, why do they fail? So do you see any scope of research in this particular area? And what sort of methods can one use to approach these questions? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, great question. And it's, very useful. And I would say, absolutely, we can learn from understanding more about failure. Like if we only look at success cases and we're missing half the picture. If you think of, say, a venture capital type portfolio, for the ones that come to the end, of every 10 investments, 2 or 3 are going to be complete write-offs, maybe even 4 or 5, and then they survive on 1 or 2 home runs. So the downside can be more frequent and costly than the upside, but they only really need one enormous hit on the upside to be successful. And so that brings us then to the question on the downside, how do you get the data? Well, the venture capital data sets, they're easy on that issue because they normally record the failed transactions. The one caveat, though, is an area that I find to be quite fun. And if you figure out how to get the data, I'd be happy to chat with you about this, is the area of zombie companies and zombie funds, and zombie sort of like these, movies and TV shows. But you might say, how does that relate to entrepreneurship? Well, I learned from my neighbor in Toronto. I used to live in Toronto up to 2018. And my neighbor in Toronto ran a fund that cleaned up problematic funds. So sort of the zombie living dead funds. And so in venture capital data sets, we have a problem of bad reporting, so it's very often self-reporting. albeit with PitchBook, they do a little bit more of an aggressive strategy to get their data. But say SDC and other companies are often based on self-reported data. And if you're a zombie venture capital fund, you're not going to be self-reporting your lack of activity. And so those kind of areas could be very, useful to understand. And then there are different types of failure. Of course, there's failure by mistake, by lack of planning, and maybe I could get more than three, but the other one that comes immediately to my mind is fraud. And then in the crowdfunding area, of course, it's very hard to actually distinguish between those things. Which one's a fraud, which one is because the entrepreneur is not very clever, and who did the lack of planning, and so that type of thing is worthwhile examining more. We had a paper that recently in the Journal of Business Ethics looking at which of these are actually frauds or not. But our categorization, you might sort of shrug your shoulders and say, well, that wasn't the greatest way to do it. So more things in there. Absolutely, we could do better. And then on the theory side, I think it's relatively easier, and the data issues become more problematic as we're trying to measure these things, because you have to understand where the data came from and if they're actually representative of the mistakes and other things. And so, but very much context dependent, but that's tricky and fun area though. Absolutely.
So Dr. Cumming, we asked you for 45 minutes and we are already at the 1 hour mark.
Oh, I apologize. I talked too much. That's my mistake. Sorry about that.
We enjoyed every minute of it, but I know we don't want to impose too much on your time. So let me thank you for this very wonderful session. I learned a lot and I took lots of notes as you were speaking. And I think our audience also enjoyed it very much. Thank you for being so generous with your time.
Likewise, thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And anytime anyone wants to follow up with an email or phone call or Skype call or Zoom, etc., I'm happy to chat. So thank you very much. It's my privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. And have a good day, Dr. Cumming.
You too. Have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody. Bye.